Good rainy morning. This is a 2016 Nissan Pathfinder. I think it's all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive, something. It's a sideways engine, so normally front-wheel drive. I am getting ready to do the bank 1 spark plugs and ignition coils. And in order to do that, you have to take the intake off. The intake itself is pretty straightforward to come off. It's just a matter of taking everything off of the intake to be able to get back there. So right now I have all of the 10mm bolts out of the mounting surface. I have the 10mm bolts out of the vacuum lines and solenoids. Word of advice: make sure to use something that has quick torque and not try to do this by hand, because these things will spin if you're not fast enough and quick enough and can put enough pressure on it. But anyways, it can be done if you hold like a screwdriver inside of here or something to hold that sensor still. You have a few vacuum lines that have to come off, you have a few nuts that have to come off, you have a few bolts for the throttle body that have to come off. The air box has to come out of the way. The brake reservoir has to come out of the way to be able to gain access back into there. These are, let's see, what size did I use? I think it was a 5mm. Of course you can't see it on there. It's a 5mm. These are Allen bolts. Be careful because they can't strip easily. You take the throttle body out. Okay, I'm not entirely sure where I left off here, but I think I kind of remember. You have to remove the reservoir, remove the throttle body. Just pop it off, take your wiring harness off from here just so you don't stretch it. And then underneath the throttle body, there's a 10mm bolt that holds this tube here on. After that, I see back in the back under there, you could probably see the hose clamp right about there. It's gonna have to come off of there. And I do have some long needly noses. I can reach back there and take it off. I already have it off the studs here, so technically it's out of its home. We'll see in just a second what she looks like underneath. I may end up having to take the vacuum line off for this valve here on the side of the intake too. So the intake runner valve or something. I don't know, all these hoses are extremely brittle, so I'm kind of scared to take it off, but if I break it, there's plenty of hose left there to be able to fix it back. Just like this one broke off because it's so tight on there. Even spinning it didn't do anything, so I'll come back after I get this off. I have to take that hose around back off. I have to take this hose right here off, and I'll be able to set the whole intake out of there. There is one more thing to take off. I got that hose off and this hose off. The PCV that goes into the back of the head back there, this one doesn't have one on this. Well, yes it does, right here. The back one goes straight up and has the same hose clamp on it, and it goes into the bottom of the intake. Aside from that, the intake is completely loose. I don't know why they ever decided to put a hose clamp on these, because the hoses stay on there regardless. I had a 2015 Nissan Altima that had the 2.5 in it, and that hose clamp was no longer there. Your intake has never been off on the newer generation, I guess, and maybe the older generations too, but this wiring harness right here is going to be stuck inside of a metal clamp on the back side of the intake. That was rough. Anyways, now you've got 3 10mm bolts and some squeeze clamps to pull off. Then your ignition coils come out of the back, and it should be 9/16 or 5/8. Usually they're 9/16, but I can tell you after I look at a sparky plug. Alright, the sparkulators are 9/16, and we're gonna fish them out of there. Ugh. That's gross. We're changing the back 3 now because the intake had to come off. We're changing the spark plugs and ignition coils. If you were to ever take off the intake, I would advise doing the same thing. This one was misfiring, so we're changing them all. Going back together is probably going to be easier than taking it apart because you're putting your own torque back on them, and you can make your own judgment call about what needs to go back in and what doesn't. So some of the bolts may not go back in, some of the hose clamps may not go back on, but I can't tell you which ones to put on, which ones not to put on. But the ones that absolutely need to go on is your bolts that hold down the ignition coils. The hose needs to go back on back there. The hose clamp does not have to go back on. This main hose that goes over to your brake booster absolutely has to go back on. Same with the hose clamp there. It pulls vacuum, so it's not going to push itself off. Your bracket that holds the hose on that goes to the back of the intake, which is this guy here, needs to go back on, otherwise it's going to rattle like crazy. And that is also vacuum. Your 4 bolts have to go back into the throttle body. Plug has to go back onto the throttle body. The plugs have to go back onto the ignition coils, and all of your intake bolts and nuts have to go back on. That's one thing that I would absolutely not skimp on. Now this front is gonna rattle, so they have to go back on as well. Aside from that, you're pretty much putting all the bolts on. Maybe not a couple of them, but I would. So far it's taken me probably an hour to take this off, hour and a half. A word of advice too, this thing right here gets hot, the engine mount, so make sure the engine is cool, because you have to go across that to be able to get that hose off the back if it's the first time coming off. I've burnt myself probably 5 times on that thing, and it's not happening again. I refuse to work on another engine when it's hot, unless it's absolutely necessary.